Coming up on today's episode.
You can't tell lies about politicians without the risk that they're going to do something. But you can tell lies about spiders, because who's going to do anything about that? You can't help but feel a sense of failure around the fact that you're still seeing these increasingly big problems with the population levels of insects in the countryside, despite all the work that we've done over the last 20 odd years to rectify that. You know, it's a hard business being in nature conservation sometimes.
Welcome to The Changemakers, a new podcast shining a light on the people who dedicate their careers to changing the lives of others. I'm Lydia Parkin.
And I'm Claire Edwards.
We're both former journalists who now work in the third sector.
In this podcast, we will talk to society's fixers, menders, mopper-uppers and fighters about why they do their job, what they see in their work and why it matters. This is a commentary on our world and the lives of the often unsung heroes within it, who can only do their work because members of the public choose to support them through donations or fundraising activity.
To them, their job may just be that, their job. But to us, it's remarkable what they do and achieve every day. Their stories deserve to be heard.
Hello and welcome to the final episode in our first season of The Changemakers. It's just me again today while Lydia is on maternity leave, but this episode is really thought-provoking and I'm eager for you to listen. So let's get on with the show. Bugs, insects, invertebrates, creepy crawlies, whatever you choose to call them, and you won't find me using the latter anymore after this conversation, bugs matter. Invertebrates, which are any animal without a backbone, like wasps, starfish, worms and grasshoppers, make up the greatest proportion of life on Earth. But their numbers are rapidly declining. Why should we be concerned? Well, pollinators alone, bugs who move pollen from one flower to another and therefore fertilising them, are responsible for 1 in 3 mouthfuls of the food we eat. Invertebrates control pests, they maintain and enhance soil, and they are a food source for other animals. To quote Sir David Attenborough, without them, the world's ecosystems will collapse. Enter Buglife, the only organisation in Europe devoted to the conservation of all invertebrates. Matt Shardlow is an environmental scientist and chief executive of Buglife. He's overseen numerous projects, campaigns, studies and battles in the fight to help bugs survive. But today we delve into why, despite 20 years working for Buglife, he still feels there is an enormous amount of hard work to do. You won't look at bugs in the same way again. Over to this week's changemaker, Matt. Can we start today with where it all began for you? Were you into invertebrates and wildlife in your childhood? Where did your passion come from?
Oh yeah, I can never remember not being interested in animals. Not necessarily specifically invertebrates, but certainly, you know, wildlife and natural life generally. Always been fascinated. Always the one turning over logs and rooting around in vegetation and doing that sort of thing. Yeah, so always been interested.
At what point did you decide to turn that interest into your career?
Well, it wasn't really until I was at university and I was studying environmental science, and one of the lecturers gave me a job identifying spiders, and I thought, well, this might be a useful skill to know some stuff about insects and invertebrates. So that sort of was the point where I thought, yeah, I could get interested in this. And also when you're at university, you know you're there with lots of other people with lots of interests and skills and talents, and a lot of people are interested in birds and bird conservation. But really, that's only a small part of what we need to do if we want to conserve biodiversity and look after life on the planet. So I always felt there was more to contribute by looking at the things that people weren't doing rather than the things that people were doing. So left university, went and did some voluntary work, which was with the RSUB and also with the Castle Museum in Norwich, looking through records and putting together information and looking at management planning and how you look after nature reserves, and prioritizing what are important conservation things to be doing. So looking at the rare and endangered species, looking at what they require, and trying to basically get a bit more of a sort of solid basis for the sort of nature conservation work that was being done. I did that for more or less 2 years, then got some work surveying wader birds in the Broads, and then after that was employed by the Irish Review to do ecology work on their nature reserves, and I ended up being responsible for non-avian biodiversity, which means all the plants and the invertebrates and the mammals and all the other things that aren't birds. So that was very, very rewarding job. But then there was a process which was run by a chap called Alan Stubbs, who has just got an MBE in the most recent King's Awards. So he had a process of looking at whether we were doing enough to conserve invertebrates and who could do more. And that process ended up with the establishment of Buglife as a new charity to take on a job that no one else was doing, which was looking after all the little things out there. And when they advertised, they recruited, and I was the officer they appointed to take that forward.
And there you've been ever since.
Yeah.
We'll come a bit more to your career and your perspective throughout this whole conversation, but just moving to Buglife specifically, you go on the Buglife website and one of the first things you read is help Buglife save the planet. Why do we need a charity that focuses on invertebrates specifically, and how is it saving the planet?
Well, invertebrates are the majority of species on the planet. So whether you're looking in the sea, where there's starfish and corals and worms and all sorts of things that make up much of marine life, or whether you're looking in rivers and the mayflies and the water beetles and all the other things there, or whether you're looking in terrestrial habitats, invertebrates are multitudinous in their numbers and the sorts of different species and the things that they require. And they're in difficulties. So we depend on invertebrates for healthy fresh waters. We depend on them for the food that we eat. We depend on them for removing rubbish from the countryside, not plastic rubbish, obviously, but the natural rubbish that gets put out there by animals, etc. So without invertebrates, we would struggle to survive. But the invertebrate populations themselves are in dire straits at the moment. We've lost about 60% of the invertebrate numbers. The numbers of flying insects are down by 60% in just the last 60 years in the UK. And that's a trend that we're seeing across Northern Europe, in Germany, in Denmark and elsewhere. Very steep declines in the abundance of invertebrate life. And that can't go on forever. That goes on at the current rates of decline for a few more decades. We're really going to see the natural environment struggling to survive. Flowers won't be being pollinated. Birds and bats won't have food to eat, and our crops won't be pollinated either. So it's really important that we stop this terrible decline.
So paint me a picture of what it's like to be an invertebrate in 2023. What are they experiencing? Why are they struggling?
Well, most species of invertebrates are quite specialists. Because there's so many, they all have little niches. And so, for instance, when you're looking at, say, a sawfly, a little sawfly, a relative of the bee, and they will feed on a particular sort of plant, but it won't necessarily be a plant everywhere. That it might be a common plant species, but they'll only feed on it in certain habitats, maybe in a wetland habitat, for instance. So the numbers of places these things can live in the current countryside, because we've fragmented so many of the natural habitats so dramatically, are quite limited. So as a little sawfly, you're there feeding on your plants, happily, laying your eggs. Well, if that field gets mismanaged in a year, might be drained or might be overgrazed, or someone might spray some fertilizer on it, which means the plant doesn't thrive anymore. That little sawfly will peter out. The larvae won't have anywhere to feed, and it'll go locally extinct. And that's what we're seeing all over the countryside, particularly in the south, where climate change is making areas too hot, too dry. We're seeing localized extinctions of localized species. So these are fussy specialist species, and once they start to go extinct, they really struggle to come back again. So we've got this problem that species just aren't able to move through the countryside to find new sites to live anymore.
The rate of decline, 60%, you say decline, was that in 60 years, did you say? Or was it less
60% in 20 years.
In
So
20
we're
years.
losing invertebrates at about rate of 30% a decade.
Okay, so the causes of that, climate change and displacement of environment, are they the two main causes?
Yeah, so we define it as sort of space and safety. So space is having enough places for them to live. So having that right food plant in the right habitat, making sure there's enough space for them to be able to survive and to be able to move. So that's a big part of our work, is to enable them to move again. So that's restoring and creating habitats, particularly flower-rich habitats. And we've got a scheme called beelines that has taken off massively, and really pleased to see that the European Union has adopted beelines as well. They're calling them buzz lines, but
Brilliant.
the same principle. Ways of finding corridors that will reconnect those grasslands and the wildflower areas back up so that the species can start to move again. So that's one important part of that, is the space side, and then the other side is the safety. And this is where we have quite a wide range of different issues impacting on invertebrates: pesticides and pollution, flea treatments in rivers, light pollution, all sorts of different things that are impacting on invertebrate populations and making the places where they should be thriving places where they're struggling because they're getting poisoned, or because it's no longer suitable, because the light means that they're getting predated, etc., etc. So there's all sorts of problems for them caused by the pollutions that we're putting into the environment, not least actually invasive species. So the species that we're bringing in pot plants, for instance, in the soil, and allowing to get out into the countryside, and are damaging biodiversity, damaging crops, and damaging gardens as well. So those are the sorts of the two big areas that we've got to try to fix if we're going to turn around this, as well as obviously just getting better engagement with the public so that we understand more about invertebrates, understand more how we depend on them, and understand more about the solutions. How can we reduce those levels of pollution so that it's safe again? How can we create that landscape through which the invertebrates can move and actually have that vibrant evolution going on in the countryside that we need if we're going to be safe in the future?
What do you think are the kind of most important areas of work that you're doing to tackle these various issues, and what is your role within that?
Well, as chief executive, I have to do all sorts of stuff. So the chief executive is there to make sure the staff are being looked after properly, make sure that the board is getting the information they need to have governance over the organisation, make sure we've got all our systems and processes in place, managing the key staff. So there's all that normal organisational management stuff that a CEO does. I also get involved a bit with pesticides because we haven't got anyone specifically working on pesticides at the moment. And as an organisation, we are trying to find strategic solutions. So we mentioned beelines a minute ago, but also identifying where those important invertebrates are, where the endangered species are living. And that's a scheme we've got called Important Invertebrate Areas, which is effectively mapping where all the important places are for invertebrates so that they can be better looked after by everyone, incorporated into local plans, incorporated into statutory agency plans, incorporated into how we're managing farmland. So defining those important invertebrate areas, which is still a bit of a work in progress, and making sure that we're looking after those areas which are still very important for endangered species. Those are two important big schemes. And then, of course, the making stuff safe is a very mixed bag. A lot of policy work with government, effectively. So trying to persuade government to take light pollution seriously, trying to put in place new processes for checking that pesticides are safe before they get approved for use. Those are all the sorts of things we're trying to do, and working with Parliament, working with scientists to try to make progress in those areas.
It certainly feels like it is a real collaborative effort of multiple wildlife organisations, charities, individuals, scientists, the government, who will come to again. To what extent is that the case, and how important to you do you think that collaboration is in this effort?
Yeah, Buglife was set up through a collaborative process. When Alan Stubbs set up those initial meetings, he brought together everyone from statutory agencies to nature conservation bodies like the RSPB and the wildlife trusts, through to small organisations like the British Millipede and Isopod Study Group and the Dipterists Forum, and all of those charities are now members of Buglife. So we've got like 40 member organisations. So we start from the basis of being a partnership body. We're not independent as such from them all. They're all company members, so they all get to say at our AGM about what we do and that sort of thing. So we start on a partnership basis, but yeah, we're a small organisation. We're never going to be enormous. We'd much like to, grow and get bigger so we can deliver more and make our initiatives to save bugs more widespread and more commonly used. But at the end of the day, we do this working with others, and a really good example, is the work we're doing looking at invertebrate abundances, which we're doing with the Kent Wildlife Trust. So ourselves and Kent Wildlife Trust run the scheme called Bugs Matter, which is active in the summer, and people download an app and they can record the number of insects hitting the number plate of their car, and that gives us data about how many insects there are across the whole of the UK. So yeah, everything we do, we're doing with other people. And unless we get the whole of society working to fix this problem of invertebrate declines, we're not going to get to the end we want.
And on that matter, do you think people care enough about invertebrates? And by people, I mean me and people living in towns and cities across the UK and the world. And should they care more?
I think they care more than they used to. And I think the message about bees has got home, so people realise there's a problem with bees. They may think it's something to do with honeybees and not something to do with wild bees. So, yeah, I mean, of course, I do think that we've got work still to do in terms of getting our message out more broadly, getting more people to understand how important invertebrates are, and also understanding the solutions like bee lines, like important invertebrate areas, like the sort of policy stuff that government should be doing, and also things that people can do in their own homes and gardens to reduce light pollution or to make their gardens more suitable for nesting invertebrates, for instance. So yeah, there's a lot more that we need to do if we're going to get society to the point where actually the momentum that we need to reverse these declines is in place.
Bugs get pretty bad PR, don't they? I mean, how much does the representation of insects and bugs in popular culture worry you? For example, since becoming a parent, I've realised that spiders are demonised in lots of children's books, as are lots of animals like snakes and things like that. I know that that's not an invertebrate, but I've noticed how certain animals carry certain stigma from babies. And then you've got things like maggots and ants in I'm a Celebrity. Does that worry you? And how would you ever go about changing some of the negative perceptions of these animals?
Yeah, I mean, it does depend what sort of animal you are to some degree. People do like bees, they like ladybirds, they like lacewings.
Yeah, some bugs have a good reputation, don't they?
Yeah, there are some good ones, and some ones that people don't appreciate so much. Every year there'll be some stories around wasps, and they always come from the same place. They always, when you dig down deep enough, you'll find that there's a press release from a pesticide company or from a pest controller, and because it's about wasp, it gets picked up in some local media channel, and it'll get picked up by the Daily Mail or another one of the big national papers, and then next thing you know, you've got some horror story being run, and it's appalling. Actually, some of it. So spiders, because spiders sell papers, they really do. If you put a spider on the cover, people will buy it.
Yeah.
So papers love sort of negative stories about spiders biting people and them getting in. And it's normally, when you look into it, they can't stand it up. They can't stand the stories up. Often they've been told before they run the story that it's impossible, but the story's so good. And there's no comeback, is there? So you can't tell lies about politicians without the risk that they're going to do something. But you can tell lies about spiders, because who's going to do anything about that? And that's one of the problems I think we've got with our media at the moment. They just get away with all sorts of stuff when it comes to invertebrates and giving them a bad press that really they shouldn't be getting away with. It's not good factual coverage at all. So yeah, there is a problem. We try to ameliorate it. We have a Love Spiders campaign that we run every so often with celebrities getting involved with saying how they like spiders and just trying to put some of that alternative narrative out there, really.
It's a big job, that one, isn't it?
Yeah. But, you've got to bear in mind that people are very flexible in the long term. So while you've got all these memes in the short term and it's very difficult to get away from them, that doesn't necessarily mean that in 100 years' time, children's books will have the same connotations in them.
Do you feel personally impacted by what you see and discover when you see the results from your Bugs Matter and when you learn about what's happening to these species? How does it impact you personally?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So with the Bugs Matter work that we've done with the Kent Wildlife Trust, where we found 30% decline per decade, we weren't expecting that to be quite so blunt or quite so marked. And, a lot of us in Buglife, we've been working in this for quite a while, and you can't help but feel a sense of failure around the fact that you're still seeing these increasingly big problems with the population levels of insects in the countryside, despite all the work that we've done over the last 20 odd years to rectify that. It's a hard business being in nature conservation sometimes. It'd be a bit as if if you're working in the National Health Service and you could see that every decade 30% more people were dying from preventable illnesses. Every decade 30% more. Or if you're working in homelessness and every decade you're getting 30% more homeless people than the previous decade.
Yeah.
That is hard. It is tough.
Yeah, the numbers are shocking, aren't they? They really are.
Yeah, no, and you look at what's happening with climate change and our failure as a society to address the really big issues that we're facing: climate change, biodiversity loss. The leaders get together, they say some nice things, and they go back and the vested interests take control again. And you end up with just inadequate movement, inadequate approach to addressing these big issues again and again and again. And that is hard work. But we have to keep on going, and that's what we do at Buglife. So, we keep setting the solutions, we keep pointing out the scientific information, and we keep encouraging people to make sensible decisions about the future.
And talking about some of your kind of flagship programs, I don't know if that's the right way of calling them, but Bugs Matter, you've touched on it. Your summer long campaign, asking people to measure insect splats on the number plates. I love it. It's great. For me, I immediately thought of my children and getting them helping me to wipe down my number plate and take part in it. So tell me a bit more. What's it all about? Where did it come from? How can people take part, and what are you trying to discover with that?
The first Bugs Matter type survey was actually done by the RSGB in 2004, and they got some of their members to go out and trial this. And that's fantastic because it gives us a data set that goes back over 20 years, or goes back about 20 years. We've run it now for the last 3 years. This is the third year we've run it again consecutively as a national survey. And we get 3,000 or 4,000 people every year going out, driving their cars and measuring the bugs. And to do that, really simple, you just download an app, clean your number plate, and when you get to the end of the journey, you count the number of bugs on your number plate. Job done.
Simple. And what are you looking to measure there? I mean, why is that a good measure of what's happening?
Well, it gives you a measure of the number of flying insects above roads, is technically what you're looking at, really. And because we're doing it over several months through different weather conditions, we can look at the effects of weather. We can also, to some degree, look at the effects of landscape because we know where the cars have been driving. So we can sort of work out, on these days or on these routes, did they get a different result in terms of the numbers of insects? And what we're hoping this will do, and next year I think we'll probably extend it so it runs for slightly longer, so we get a May involved as well. Previously and this year included, we start in June, but hopefully we'll get improve that level of data, so the amount of information we're coming out in about what insects are around, where and when, And, in the longer term, when the data builds up, hopefully start to understand some of the questions about why. Can we relate the abundance of insects to the pattern of pesticide use? Could we relate the abundance of insects to the time of day? Does that change over time? Does that change with weather? Does that change with light pollution levels? There's all sorts of other factors we can start to bring in to compare what numbers of insects people are counting in different places to what's actually going on in the landscape, in the atmosphere, et cetera, that might influence those numbers.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Such a simple initiative that actually can give you so much insight.
But yeah, really, really good and important data set. And, you think if you're a swift and you're having to feed on those same insects, we've seen declines in insect feeding birds in recent years as well. Well, this data helps us to understand better what it is that's driving those declines.
And talking about bugs moving around, then you have mentioned your beelines as well, which is something I loved discovering. Can you share a bit more about this as well? I'd just love to have a little bit more elaboration on the concept behind them, what is stopping bugs being able to move around, and how the beelines is trying to help that.
Sure. So the natural habitats of many bug species, particularly the specialist ones, are now highly fragmented. So they're living in small little parcels of land scattered across the countryside. What we did with beelines was we asked the question, how can we most effectively join those back up again? So it starts with a computer program that basically has data in there around where the remaining wildflower areas in the countryside. It then does a clever bit of algorithm mapping and says, right, these are the quickest routes that you can do to join them back up again. We then take those initial plans and we talk to local people about them. So it's done at a county level usually. We will take the plan and say, this is what the computer says we should do. And then those people have a chance to give us their opinions. And they can sort of say, well, why don't we shift this one a bit here or move that one there because that brings in an opportunity, or we want to include the coast, or there's a footpath there. So if we put that along the footpath, then people will be able to enjoy it. Or why don't we join Sheffield and Leeds up with a corridor, that sort of thing. So there's then a sort of slightly less scientific process where they get moved around a little bit. But we all obviously can always make sure, because we're doing it at a national level as well, that they all join up. So that gives us now a network, and you can go onto our website and see the beelines network. You can also see where people are working on the beelines network, and thousands of people across the country spending millions of pounds trying to help our bees and other invertebrates by improving the management of areas within the beelines. And if we can do that, and we can get, say, 10% of those beelines better managed for insects, then quite a lot of insect species should start moving again in response to climate change. And we should be able to get that dynamic countryside that's alive, and not species that are slowly going extinct, stuck on little sites across the countryside, which is the current situation for too many species.
And how significant does the space have to be? Because if I put a little wildflower patch in my garden, or I don't mow my lawn, or I have some bee-friendly plants, is that enough? Or are we talking? We have noticed this year hedgerows have been left, it seems, around where I live, certainly, to grow a lot longer. I've noticed it personally. Does it take mass kind of spaces like that, or can we all be part of the beelines and making it easier for invertebrates to move around?
We can all do stuff to help invertebrates and bees. If you've got a garden or even a window box, you can plant some species of plants that are native, because they provide not only nectar and pollen, but also can provide food plants to moths and butterflies and sawflies that otherwise wouldn't have anywhere else to live. So we can all do more by planting the right sorts of plants, not mowing our lawn. The no mow May scheme is very good for putting more nectar and pollen into the countryside. But ultimately, we can't do it on our own. So getting local authorities, as you say, to allow their playing areas, or well, most of them aren't playing areas that we see. Actually, we see quite large areas where they're just been mowing stuff solidly forever because that's what they've always done, and actually, turning those into meadows, much more fun recreationally, really, and provides much more biodiversity around where people are living. Roadside verges, getting those into much more sensible management, so they're not just cutting them for no obvious reason every single year everywhere. Saves money, saves carbon, and saves biodiversity. So there's stuff that we can do with local authorities, but then there's also stuff that only really government can do. Stuff around farming policy, stuff around pollution policy, stuff around, you know, the resources available to restore habitats. But really, there's only a central government role for those sorts of things, whichever country you're living in.
And talking about government, earlier in June, the Science, Innovation and Technology Committee took questions on insect decline, and I understand that Buglife gave written evidence. What is the role of government in this, and how have you found trying to influence them? What change really would you like to see at that level?
Getting UK government particularly, but it also goes for the devolved governments to some degree, to take environmental issues seriously is very difficult. It tends to take you a long time to convince DEFRA there's something they need to worry about, which is the Department of Environment. Even when they are convinced there's something that they should be worrying about, they then have to convince all the other departments. So you sometimes start with something that looks like a pretty good proposal, but by the time it's done the rounds around government departments, it's weakened down to the point where it's nearly useless. So frequently we see, even when we do make the arguments, even when we do provide the evidence, even when we do get to the point where really there is no alternative. You know, a classic example is flea treatments. We're using fipronil and imidacloprid. These are substances that are banned for agricultural use because they're so damaging to the environment. But our rivers are still heavily polluted with these insecticides because they're coming out of flea treatments, getting on people's hands, getting on dog bedding, cat litter getting flushed down the toilet, all sorts of ways that these chemicals are getting into the environment and causing harm. There's no question in my mind that government should have banned their use, or at least suspended it until they got better data. Because at the moment, they haven't got a plan. They're allowing this environmental destruction to continue year after year and not taking any steps to resolve it. It would be a simple thing to do.
Can you treat fleas without it?
There are a bunch of other chemicals that are used for flea treatments. We don't know, to be honest, whether those are safe, but we do know that fipronil and imidacloprid are not safe. And we know that the levels of those occurring in the environment, because they're persistent long-term insecticides, are at harmful levels. So, you know, there may be a question about whether any of them are safe, but at the moment, while we don't know that, let's at least tackle the issue with the ones that we do know are damaging the environment to get rid of those.
Like you say, that feels like quite a straightforward kind of idea to implement.
It is.
Make impact.
It is. Easily done, regulated. Yeah, you know, there are people who will suffer as a result. People who are manufacturing those chemicals will no longer be able to sell them as much as they used to in the past. So, but it's a pretty simple thing to fix. If we can't fix simple things like that, it does make one concerned about some of the harder questions we'll have to ask around, you know, where do we find the space for life to survive alongside humans in the British Isles? And that's a much harder question. So it's really difficult. And I tend to find actually it's a bit easier working with Europe and with the European Commission. They tend to be a bit more open-minded around their role as an environmental protector, but also around looking at the science and looking at the evidence and responding responsibly at a strategic level to that science and the evidence. So we have had a lot more success, to be quite frank, for instance, with the banning of neonicotinoid insecticides across Europe, while in the UK we're still derogating for their use, despite the fact that they've been banned across the whole continent. And, you know, even persuading the European Union to put in place a zero residue level tolerance.
What does that mean?
Which sounds awfully technical, and it is. So the EU will only import crops into the EU if they contain zero neonicotinoids. the UK is refusing to do this at the moment, so we're willing to take crops from countries that are still using chemicals that are destroying the environment. So the EU is breaking new ground by effectively putting in place this, what it amounts to a ban on other countries using certain insecticides. And the UK just not interested in taking part in that sort of, work to protect pollinators in other countries.
Why? Why is it so hard?
Sometimes it's because our government doesn't have anyone in the government, in the government departments who actually know and understand the issue. So you start at the point of not really having anyone to talk to on side. So that's a bit of an issue. And it comes back also to the way that we do politics in the UK, which is very much behind closed doors, not very publicly accessible. Say, take the pesticides stuff. All of those decisions are made behind closed doors. We're supposed to be signed up to the Aarhus Convention, which is about public participation in environmental decision making. We're making lots of environmental decisions behind closed doors, and that means that they get heavily influenced by vested interests who are behind those closed doors, and not by the public who aren't behind those closed doors. So that's part of the issue, and this departmental thing where DEFRA may decide and resolve that they're going to fix a problem, but when it gets through to the Treasury cut the budget or say they can't.
How important are farmers in this issue? Because I know there have been efforts to encourage more sustainable and wildlife-friendly farming practices. Again, I believe particularly the EU have played a role in this, but how important are there, and are efforts working on making a difference?
Well, people who manage the countryside, who often are farmers, obviously are key to resolving these issues. They've suffered, I think, at the hands of narrow-minded view of what the countryside should be like. The idea that there are some places which are for food and there are some places which are for wildlife doesn't really work, particularly when you're using chemicals like neonicotinoids, which get into the rivers and get into the wildflowers and road verges and in hedgerows and poison wildlife. So we need to find a way that we produce food more sustainably. And farmers are part of that. There are some amazing farmers out there who do fantastic work and doing everything they can, and pioneering, and there's a lot of pioneering, look at no-till work, look at forestry where they're putting in, tree lines of trees across arable land to improve the sustainability. There's some really good work looking at how we can have a more sustainable food production system. It's hampered by the NFU, who are resolutely and pretty much without failing opposed to any environmental measure that comes forward.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And you end up with things like there was ecological focus areas, which are supposed to help farmers to get more environmentally friendly. Well, the farming lobby managed to change the minister's mind and allow the use of pesticides on ecological focus areas, which of course meant that they didn't deliver for anything. So you end up with something called ecological focus areas that no one's got any faith in, that the farmers say is ridiculous, that the environmental workers say is ridiculous. And of course, then you lose that. So it would be fantastic if we had more farmers who were coming together to help the environment, not just doing stuff on their own, but actually making sure that the NFU stopped the anti-environmental stuff that they've been participating in for as long as I can remember. And maybe, look at other organizations like the Nature Friendly Farming Network, who are really committed to more sustainable future for farming. We can all have sympathy with farmers for having to provide cheap food supermarkets. And, the system that we've got at the moment means that you've got big corporate supermarkets and the farmers don't have much individual say. And again, there must be some ways that can be changed. But that's about farmers learning to work together, perhaps. So yeah, that one can have sympathy with farmers because of the economic situation that we're in, but also the regulatory situation they will use pesticides that have been approved by government, and they feel that they're safe if they've been approved by government, despite the fact that we know that there's kind of this sort of cycle of activity where people approve pesticides for use, and then 5-10 years later they find that actually they're causing some horrendous damage, or they're carcinogenic, and then they get pulled off the shelves. So at any one point in time, pesticides are all safe according to government. But at any one point in time, if you look back 10 or 20 years, you'll find that a good proportion of those pesticides that they were saying at that time were all safe turn out not to be safe. And so there are some real issues there that farmers, as much as anyone else, should be able to see through some of the hyperbole and some of the, the myths around pesticides and their safety, and actually think maybe as a sector, as a farming sector, we should be acting more together to try to get a more sustainable future for us and our children.
What change would you like to see that would be truly impactful for invertebrates, if it was just down to you?
I'd like to see the environment be more political. I think in the UK, if it's not political, it's nowhere in terms of decision making. We know that the environment's high up people's lists of priorities, and has been again recently. It sort of fluctuates a little bit from time to time. But really, we do need to have an election or a series of elections where the environment is part of the focus. And sometimes it feels like that journalism is part of the problem here as well, because you tend to get politics being reported on by social scientists or politics graduates, and they don't get the technical scientific stuff, and a lot of the environmental stuff is quite technical in the environment, so it tends to get pushed off into sort of a side avenue, not get mainstreamed with some of the other political commentary.
It goes into the science section.
It goes, let's cover that in science. That's nice and technical, and you lose it out of that political narrative. So there seems to be this kind of failure to link together from, we're concerned about biodiversity loss, we're concerned about the environment, how are we holding government to account about that? And even when you look at sort of the coverage of these issues on the main channels, I mean, how often did Brexit come up on Question Time compared with climate change? How often did we have people from small political parties promoting Brexit on there compared with people from small political parties promoting a more sustainable environment? I can't explain that. I don't know if you can, Claire, but it doesn't seem to tally, really.
I can't explain it. I wish I could.
How do we make government actually properly accountable? And I don't think we've quite cracked it. The Environment Act that we put through after Brexit has got targets in it, but they're long-term targets. There's no milestones. So what are you holding the ministers accountable for delivering or not delivering? We've got a 30-30 target at the moment in the UK. Most people don't know that, but that means that 30% of the countryside should be managed for wildlife by 2030. Well, 2030 is just around the corner.
What is the proportion now? If they're saying 30% of the land should be, do you know what the current proportion is?
Less than 10.
Wow. Okay.
So you can quibble about this a bit. So when they first produced the figures, Boris Johnson claimed that all the national parks were being managed for biodiversity. they patently are not being managed for biodiversity. They're being managed for agriculture and various other things. And I think government has accepted that they can't use that statistic. So they started off by saying 26%.
Right.
I think they've gone away from that. I don't know the government's got an actual figure themselves, but the NGOs are saying somewhere between 6 and 10% you can claim. And if we're going to get 30% of our countryside to be managed for wildlife, we've got to start now. I mean, government's got to start identifying those areas, the important invertebrate areas, the other things that need protection and need looking after, identifying the resources to put in place to make that protection, looking at what we need to do to restore wildlife in other areas. You know, this is a big program of work, yet it doesn't seem to quite come together. There's a sort of a mismatch between what the public want and the fact that in the UK we've got members of all these organisations that want to look after the environment, and then what the politicians actually end up doing seems something completely different.
So yeah, a lot of work to do, as you say, in not very many years on that particular aim.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a hard job, but we're making progress. You know, look at the number of people who are inputting into the bee lines. Look at the level of public concern about wild bee loss. Look at, you know, people are wanting to set targets, but they're not then following that up with the actions they need to deliver those targets, and that's the frustrating bit. You know, we can all say we want to leave the environment in a better place, but who's actually making that happen? Who's actually putting the effort in? At the moment, it's just not enough effort going in.
Quick question about your charitable status and looking at your income. It seems that Buglife rely a lot on grant funding, and you've got members looking at growing membership and legacy donations, I notice as well. How do you reflect on the work that you're doing, which, as you say, is as significant as helping us to save the planet, can only happen because you're securing donations?
What other way of doing it would there be, Claire? Well, I mean, this is an interesting question, and it's quite complex. If you go to America, America has a very strong attitude that there's stuff that government should be doing, but they should be doing the absolute minimum, and then other people should be doing stuff. And that there should be lots of philanthropy, lots of donations, and that's how, you know, good stuff. In America, it's almost at the point where, you know, healthcare for the population should be delivered by donations rather than by the state. Whereas if you go to parts of Europe, like the Nordic countries or Germany, they have a very different attitude. They expect the state to do everything. So they don't have such a strong NGO sector as we have, because if you're paying your taxes, government's going to sort out biodiversity decline. And we do have a slightly odd hybrid system in the UK where there are some things we expect government to do, and there's some things we expect to be done by NGOs, and it's not always clear where those lines lie in terms of what is suitable government action, what's suitable NGO action. A lot of the work that we do is raising profiles of issue, is pushing for change, and that's not something you could do with inside government. So I think a lot of the work that we do, both in the UK and in the EU, wouldn't work as a government activity. On the other hand, you know, one might argue that some of the work that we're doing with our grants and trust funding in terms of converting areas into places full of wildflowers and full of life again, sometimes we think we're doing that to show other people how it can be done, and we're hoping that actually government then steps up to the plate and makes sure that it is done, because we don't have the resources, nor is there resources amongst those charitable trusts that contribute to that work to achieve the outcomes in the long term. So I think there is a role for NGOs, and I think there is a role for government. And as an NGO, you know, most of our money comes from non-government sources, not quite all of it. We do get some bits and pieces from some of the statutory agencies to help them with their SSSI work or saving endangered species, for instance. But as you say, most of our income comes from grants and trusts. which is usually where people have passed away and left legacies, or financial institutes that are putting some of their money into good causes. And I hope, we do a good job of spending that money very effectively, getting massive changes like the banning of neonicotinoids across Europe, or the implementation of beelines, getting light pollution onto the government agenda. All of those sorts of things just wouldn't be happening if there wasn't a Buglife out there doing it.
You were the first paid member of staff at Buglife, is that right?
That is correct.
Just over 20 years ago?
Yeah, that's correct as well.
Since then, in that time, you've overseen so many projects, campaigns, published reports on your research, you've opened reserves, you've won awards, you've influenced some policy. How do you reflect on your contribution to this massive area of work?
Well, it's a mixed bag, isn't it? Because you can sit down and you can write down all those fantastic things that Buglife's done and achieved. And, I reckon there's probably 25 sites out there that would have been destroyed. Sites very important for endangered species where there's been completely inappropriate developments, not protected sites. Some cases we've managed to get them designated as SSSIs and protected, and they're now nature reserves. So that, there's 25 sites of great importance for invertebrates. And you can never be absolutely sure whether you've made the decisive move, but I think in several of those cases, at least, had it not been for Buglife stepping in and saving them, they would have got destroyed. You can look at the level of profile that bee issues have. You can look at the level of profile that pesticide issues now have. And a lot of that is down to the work that Buglife's done over the years. And of course, Alan Stubbs has just been awarded an MBE in recognition of the important contribution that Buglife has made to society. And, our membership has been growing. We want more people to come and join Buglife and support our work, because the more of that unrestricted funding we have, the more flexible we can be, the more we can do the uncomfortable stuff that government doesn't want us to be doing. So more members will mean more results and more outcomes. Having said all that positive stuff, we'll come back to the 30% per decade decline in insects and invertebrates. The lack of protection that many of their most important sites have, so that they're exposed to development, they're exposed to mismanagement. And it's still a huge mountain that we've got to climb to get to the point where invertebrate populations are even on par with other groups of organisms, let alone getting to the point where they're recovering and we're going to have a healthy, sustainable future for biodiversity. And then there's climate change on top of that, which is scary, just scary.
What is success for you as an individual? What is success?
Well, it's change. It's change. It is seeing these things change, whether that's at a sort of societal level of seeing people's attitudes, minds opening up and their attitudes changing, or whether it's at a specific policy point where some decision has been made, like when Michael Gove changed the UK's government position on neonicotinoids. Those sorts of things, you get a lot of sort of personal satisfaction that, after all of the jumping up and down and shouting about it, someone's finally listened, sort of thing. So those are the sorts of things that I get most pleasure for. Real clear, solid delivery across large scale. That's what we're here about, really.
You told me at the start that you were always lifting up a log and looking at what's underneath it and loved animals. Do you feel...
It feels like you've been doing a bit of that today, Claire.
Do you think that, are you, from where you were then, that young Matt knew what you'd achieved so far, do you think, are you proud of where you've come and what you've achieved with that passion and interest you've had?
I'm still the CEO of Buglife, so I still believe there's a lot more that we need to do, and that is the dominant issue. I'm hungry to see us going to deliver more, to change people's minds more, to get more partner organisations involved, to get more habitats delivered for the endangered species. That's where we're at, really. I haven't got time to sit back and sort of spend too long celebrating. Although obviously you do need to acknowledge where you do have successes. And that's important for our mental health as much as anything else, isn't it?
Definitely. And it seems to be so far a unifying feature of people who work for charities, is that a lot of the time they're still thinking about all that there is yet to do and not always spending enough time reflecting on what has been achieved. Final question, Matt. How can listeners be part of the change when it comes to invertebrates, bugs, and their role within the world we live in? Somebody listening, what could they do that really would help?
If everyone who listened to this joined Buglife, we'd be able to do a lot more stuff. So that's got to be, for me, we're the catalyst of that change. So put some funds into the catalyst and you'll get more change. And that's what I would like people to feel was true, and to go away and, give us a little bit of resources, a few tens of pounds a year. You also get learning, understanding. You start to know a bit more about the issues. It spreads that message further around society, and gives us more muscle as well. So when we then talk to the policymakers, it's one thing to be speaking on behalf of 4,000 people. It's another thing to be speaking on behalf of 40,000 people. It's being part of a movement of change. And that will enable us to speak much more strongly on behalf of invertebrates and make sure that in the future they have a brighter future.
And thank you so much for talking to me today.
No trouble, Claire. I hope we can mash something together out of all of that.
Is it weird to say thank you to Matt on behalf of all the bugs he's saving? Maybe, but as we discussed, they can't say it for themselves, so thank you, Matt. You can read more about Buglife, Bugs Matters, and how to become a member on the Buglife website, which we'll include in the show notes. We've also put a link to the NFU so you can see for yourselves what their stance is on the environment. For now, that concludes season 1 of The Changemakers. We really hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to all our brilliant guests and to everyone who's listened, shared and given us feedback. You can still like, rate and subscribe to help us reach more people, and follow us on Instagram at The Changemakers Pod. We're already making plans for season 2, which will be with you later in the year. Until then, it's goodbye from us both.